I never thought my life would fall apart like this. For years, I believed that if I worked hard, put family first, and made sacrifices, it would all come back around. As a construction manager, I'd put in long hours, handling stressful projects, and pushing through exhaustion, all with the idea that I was building something worthwhile. I wanted my family to live comfortably, to have everything I'd lacked growing up, and to know that they'd always be secure. My wife, Sarah, and I had been together almost 2 decades. She was the first person I'd really trusted, the one who made me feel like I belonged somewhere. Together, we had 3 kids, and they became the center of my world. I never missed a single event of theirs if I could help it. Their birthdays, their first steps, their endless questions about how things worked. I poured myself into those moments because that's what I thought a dad should do. Everything in my life, every tough decision or late night at work, I'd always justified with the thought of them. Looking back though, maybe I should have seen the signs. About a year ago, Sarah started acting differently. She'd become distant, distracted. At first, I chalked it up to stress. With 3 kids, both of us constantly juggling tasks, life had a way of getting hectic. She'd been run down, and I figured that once we caught a break, we'd fall back into our usual rhythm. After all, we'd been through tough patches before. Every marriage had them, and we always pulled through. But this time was different. She'd come home late or get defensive when I asked where she'd been. There were little changes, like how she'd suddenly started being glued to her phone, which was always face down on the counter. If I walked in, she'd glance up with a slightly startled look, then brush it off as if it were nothing. I tried to push it out of my mind, not wanting to believe that something deeper was going on. But a comment from a friend at a family gathering left me with a gut feeling I couldn't ignore. It was the kind of casual remark that wouldn't normally stand out, but it lingered. He'd said it was funny how my oldest kid looked nothing like me, that he must have gotten his mom's genes. At the time, I laughed it off, but later, the thought dug in. I felt ridiculous even questioning it. Doubting my own family felt wrong, like some kind of betrayal. But that comment stayed with me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it grew. I started noticing other things, how our youngest had features that didn't quite resemble either of us, how Sarah sometimes avoided eye contact during conversations about the future, and how she seemed more restless. It felt like I was piecing together a puzzle, but I wasn't even sure what the final picture would look like. The doubts turned into questions that I couldn't voice. I worried that if I even brought them up, I'd risk tearing everything apart. But as the weeks passed, those suspicions ate away at me. Then one night, I walked into the kitchen and saw Sarah, standing there in the dim light, her back to me as she whispered into her phone. I watched for a moment, waiting for her to notice me. When she finally turned and saw me, her expression shifted, just for a split second, but it was enough. She quickly put her phone down, muttering something vague about catching up with an old friend. It didn't sit right. I knew that look. I'd seen it before on job sites, workers hiding mistakes they didn't want me to see, clients holding back on details that would have cost them. That was when I knew. It was no longer a stray thought or a fleeting suspicion. I had to know the truth, and I was finally ready to start searching for it. After that night in the kitchen, everything changed. Once you start doubting, it's like a floodgate opens. Every interaction with Sarah felt like it had another layer, something unspoken hiding underneath. I noticed things I'd never paid attention to before. How she'd excuse herself to the other room to take calls, or how she'd suddenly have plans pop up that she couldn't fully explain. Each excuse, each sidelong glance, fed into a growing sense that my life wasn't what I thought it was. I knew I had to be smart about this. It wasn't enough to rely on gut feelings. If I was wrong, then I was risking my marriage, my kids, everything I'd spent years building. But if I was right, well, I needed to be sure. So, I began to do something I'd never imagined doing in a million years. I started to watch. Quietly, carefully, I kept track of her schedule, noticing when she'd say she was at the store or out with friends but would come home hours later than expected. Each time I asked where she'd been, she'd brush it off, saying I was paranoid or working too hard. She'd give me a look like I was being ridiculous, and I'd feel guilty for even questioning her. But deep down I knew. There was one particular day that sticks with me. It was a Saturday, and Sarah had told me she'd be out helping a friend with some things. She left early, promising she'd be back by lunch. I busied myself around the house, thinking maybe this was just a bump we'd get over, that I'd look back and laugh at my own insecurities. But hours went by. Noon turned into the afternoon, and finally, as the sun started to set, she came through the door, looking tired and distracted. I asked how her day went, and she gave me some vague answer that didn't line up with what she'd told me before she left. That night, as she fell asleep beside me, I lay awake, replaying the day in my mind, trying to find some logical explanation. But no matter how I turned it, it didn't make sense. I remembered the way she'd avoided looking at me when she came home, the almost forced smile on her face. It felt like the pieces were falling into place, each one revealing something darker than I wanted to admit. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed something concrete, something that would either confirm my worst suspicions or prove me wrong once and for all. So, I did what I never thought I'd do. I ordered DNA tests. I reasoned with myself that it was just to quiet the noise in my head. I'd test the kids, prove to myself that everything was fine, and let it go. But part of me knew that I wasn't doing it to prove I was wrong. The kits arrived, and I waited for the right moment. I felt like a criminal, taking the samples when the kids weren't paying attention. My hands were shaking as I sealed them up, feeling a mix of shame and dread. But there was no going back now. I mailed them off and waited, telling myself I'd accept whatever the results showed. Days stretched into a week, and each one felt like it lasted a lifetime. I went through the motions at work, trying to keep my mind off the envelope that would be arriving any day now, carrying answers I wasn't sure I wanted. I'd see Sarah across the dinner table, laughing with the kids, and wonder what secrets were hidden behind that familiar face. I started noticing every little detail, the way she'd check her phone under the table or glance out the window as if she was waiting for someone. My heart sank a little more each day, but there was no turning back. When the results finally arrived, I was alone in the house. Sarah was out running errands, and the kids were at school. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, like it carried the weight of everything I'd built over the years. I sat down at the kitchen table, bracing myself, and opened it. What I read confirmed every gut feeling, every nagging doubt. None of the kids were biologically mine. I don't think I moved for a long time after that. I just sat there, staring at the paper in disbelief, as if the words might change if I looked long enough. It was like the ground had disappeared beneath me, and I was left floating, untethered to anything real. Everything I thought I'd known about my life, my family, was a lie. And in that moment, I knew there was no going back. The person I'd trusted most in the world had betrayed me in a way I couldn't begin to comprehend. After the shock wore off, it left something darker in its place. I felt hollow, like the life I'd lived wasn't mine anymore, like I was just some actor in a story someone else had written. I couldn't shake the thought that my whole marriage, the family I'd sacrificed for, was built on a lie. Sarah, the woman I'd loved for nearly 20 years, had deceived me in the deepest way possible. And what cut even deeper was the realization that it wasn't just once. It had to be years, maybe even from the very beginning. I wanted to confront her immediately, to throw those results in her face and demand answers. But the rational part of me held back. This wasn't something I could approach without a plan. I'd seen enough people lose everything in divorces because they'd acted on impulse. If I went in without a strategy, without solid evidence, she'd twist things around. Sarah was smart, sharper than she let on, and if she'd been hiding this from me for so long, she'd have no problem manipulating things in her favor. I thought about the kids too. I'd loved them with everything I had, watched them grow up, and poured my soul into raising them. They didn't know the truth, and as far as I was concerned, they didn't need to. I wasn't about to hurt them by taking my anger out on their mom in front of them. But this meant that I had to be careful, patient even when it felt like my world was burning down. So, I started laying the groundwork, piece by piece. The first step was finding a lawyer. I needed someone sharp, someone who'd seen the worst in people and knew how to protect clients in situations like this. A friend recommended a guy he'd worked with during his own rough divorce, a family lawyer who was known for being tough but fair. The lawyer listened as I laid out the story, his face barely registering emotion, which somehow made me feel steadier. He advised me to gather as much proof as I could. The DNA results were a start, but I'd need more if I wanted to come out of this with my assets intact. So, I began documenting things. Every odd behavior, every suspicious glance, every excuse she gave, I wrote it all down. I kept the results hidden in a drawer in my office at work, just in case. And I started setting up things around the house. Nothing that would tip her off, just small cameras and recording devices in places where I thought she might let something slip. It felt wrong, like I was betraying my own values, but I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. In the meantime, I did my best to keep up appearances. I went to work, came home, and did my best to be there for the kids, even if every time I looked at them, there was a small, painful reminder of the betrayal that loomed over everything. I'd get home from a long day and see Sarah laughing with them, acting like nothing was wrong, and it took every ounce of strength I had to keep myself from letting it all out. One night, I caught her sneaking a glance at her phone and slipping into the bathroom, her voice lowered to a whisper. I walked quietly up to the door, listening for any clue. I heard her talking softly, her tone the same one she used to use with me back when things were good between us. She was reassuring someone, telling them not to worry, that everything was going as planned. It was all I needed to confirm that she was actively plotting something, possibly planning her exit. As the days went on, Sarah's behavior only grew more suspicious. There were more friends she needed to help, more excuses, more absences that lasted longer than they should have. And through it all, I kept gathering what I needed, each small piece a part of the larger picture I was trying to build. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I almost confronted her on the spot, when the weight of the betrayal felt too heavy to bear. But then I'd remind myself that I needed to be smart. This wasn't just about my anger or the hurt she'd caused. This was about the life I'd built, the years of work, and the sacrifices I'd made. If I didn't play my cards right, she'd walk away with everything I'd worked for, taking the kids and half of everything I owned. I wasn't about to let her get away with that. Finally, I knew it was time to act. The evidence was there, clear as day, and the lawyer was ready to move forward. The betrayal still burned, but now I had something to fight for. This was about reclaiming my life, about refusing to let her lies define the years I had left. And as painful as it would be to take the next steps, I knew I had no other choice. Over the next few weeks, I went through the motions at home, but inside, I was already detaching. I knew it wouldn't be long before things came to a head, and I didn't want to be blindsided by whatever cards she still had up her sleeve. Every day felt like a balancing act. I'd have to stay calm, play the loving husband, even as I knew the betrayal ran deeper than I could have ever imagined. It was a strange feeling, lying awake at night beside her, listening to her breathe, knowing that she had been deceiving me, scheming behind my back. I continued gathering evidence. The cameras captured her on the phone late at night, sometimes leaving the house early in the morning, making all kinds of excuses. On one particular morning, she'd claimed she needed to run an errand for work, yet she came back 3 hours later, looking flustered, her hair a little messy, her shirt buttoned wrong. Each new piece of evidence added to the pile, proof that whatever life she'd been building behind my back was more real to her than the one we'd built together. One day, I got a call from the lawyer, saying he'd found out she'd already met with a divorce attorney. My stomach dropped. She'd gone so far as to discuss taking the kids, the house, and even half of my retirement. She knew exactly what she wanted and, apparently, felt confident enough that I wouldn't do anything to stop her. But she hadn't counted on me being one step ahead. When I got home that night, I remember looking at her across the dinner table. She was smiling, laughing with the kids, acting like nothing was wrong. But I saw through it all now. Her warmth, her affection. It was all a mask. This woman, the mother of my children, the woman I'd shared my life with for nearly 2 decades, was capable of leaving me with nothing. And the worst part was, she was prepared to do it without a shred of guilt. As the days ticked by, I felt a mix of dread and determination. I knew that I'd have to confront her eventually, but I wanted it to be on my terms, with everything out in the open. I wasn't going to let her control the narrative or turn things around on me. The lawyer had prepped me well, and together, we'd built a case that was solid. The DNA results, the recordings, the messages. All of it would ensure that when the truth came out, she wouldn't be able to manipulate the situation. The night before we went to court, I could barely sleep. I kept thinking of the years we'd spent together, the family moments, the laughter, the closeness we once had. It was painful, knowing it had all been a facade. But there was no room for sympathy now. She'd made her choice long before I discovered the truth. This was about survival, about protecting what was left of my life. When morning came, I dressed in my best suit, the one I'd worn on our wedding day. Sarah was in the kitchen, her back turned as she fixed breakfast, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. I watched her for a moment, feeling a strange sense of calm. She thought she was in control, that she could waltz into court and walk away with everything I'd worked for. But she was about to find out just how wrong she was. As I walked out the door, I realized that I felt stronger than I had in years. Today would be the beginning of the end of this nightmare. I'd built my life with my own 2 hands, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me, not even her. The courtroom felt cold that morning. I sat alone on one side, waiting for the judge to enter, feeling the weight of everything that had brought me to this moment. My lawyer sat beside me, his presence steadying, a reminder that I wasn't facing this alone. I kept my eyes focused ahead, but every so often, I'd feel Sarah's gaze from across the room. I knew she was watching, probably expecting me to crumble under the weight of what she'd done. When the judge entered, there was a hush that settled over the room. The proceedings started, and I could feel the tension growing with each word that was spoken. Sarah's lawyer laid out her case confidently, talking about our marriage as though it were nothing more than a business arrangement to be dissolved. He painted her as a loving mother and wife who'd simply grown apart from her husband, and who deserved her fair share in the divorce. As he spoke, I could feel the anger boiling inside me, the frustration of being reduced to a few sentences that couldn't begin to touch the betrayal I'd endured. When it was my lawyer's turn, he rose calmly and began to unfold the story we'd pieced together. He started with the DNA results, stating plainly that none of the children I'd raised were biologically mine. I could feel the room go still as he presented the evidence, and I glanced at Sarah, hoping to catch her reaction. She sat there, expression frozen, though I could see the faintest flicker of surprise in her eyes. It was the first crack in her armor. My lawyer continued, revealing the surveillance footage, the late-night phone calls, the records of her meetings with a divorce attorney. Each piece of evidence was like a hammer driving home the reality of her deceit. I kept my gaze forward, refusing to let her see how much it hurt to hear all of this laid out in cold, hard facts. But it was a relief too, knowing that the truth was finally being exposed, that I was no longer alone in bearing the weight of her lies. As my lawyer finished, the judge looked over at Sarah with a sharp, questioning gaze. It was clear that the evidence was irrefutable, that she couldn't twist this into something it wasn't. Sarah's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for the mountain of proof we'd brought. I could see Sarah's confidence starting to falter, her carefully crafted story beginning to crumble under the weight of the truth. When it was her turn to respond, she tried to remain calm, claiming that I was overreacting, that she'd simply been seeking friendship and support outside our marriage. She tried to paint me as the paranoid husband, desperate to control her every move. But the facts spoke louder than any of her excuses. The DNA tests, the recordings, the lawyer visits. No one in that room could deny what was right in front of them. As the judge listened to her attempts to explain, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and satisfaction. Sadness, because this was the woman I'd once loved, the woman I'd trusted with everything, now reduced to a desperate, lying version of herself. And satisfaction, because for the first time, I was no longer the fool in this story. I'd taken control, and I wasn't going to let her rewrite the narrative to suit her needs. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor. The assets would be divided differently, and she wouldn't walk away with the life she'd hoped to take. The custody arrangements would be altered too, ensuring that I'd remain an important part of the kids' lives, despite not being their biological father. As I listened to the final decision, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was as if a weight had lifted, like I could finally breathe again. When the proceedings ended, I didn't look back as I left the courtroom. I walked out with my head held high, feeling more like myself than I had in months. I'd reclaimed my life, my dignity, and my future. And while the road ahead wouldn't be easy, I knew that I could face it, stronger and more resilient than before. Walking out of that courtroom felt like stepping into a new life. But as I got to my car and sat there in silence, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The judge's ruling had given me a chance to reclaim what Sarah had tried to take from me, but it hadn't erased the pain or the loss. My life as I knew it had been torn apart, and now I was left to pick up the pieces. I wasn't even sure what that would look like. The home we'd shared, the memories, and even the dreams I'd held onto, all of it felt tainted now. Over the next few days, I went through the motions of daily life, not fully processing everything that had happened. Sarah had moved out temporarily, and the house felt quieter, almost like a stranger's place. There were traces of her everywhere, pictures on the walls, her handwriting on little notes stuck to the fridge, even her perfume lingering in the air. I went around the house, picking up items that reminded me of our old life, feeling the need to clear out the things that belonged to her, that held memories I didn't want to face yet. The kids were a different story, though. I couldn't look at them the same way, even though I tried. They were still my kids in every way that mattered, but the truth lingered in the back of my mind, an unspoken distance that I struggled to bridge. I'd spent years being their dad, being there for their first steps, their birthdays, their scraped knees and bedtime stories. And I wasn't about to abandon them now. But as much as I wanted to move forward, I found myself questioning everything. My role in their lives, the relationship we'd shared, and the future I'd imagined for them. One night, my oldest came into the living room and sat down beside me, sensing something was wrong. Kids are smart like that. They can pick up on things even when you think you're hiding it well. They didn't know the full story, of course, but they could tell there was tension, that something had changed between their mom and me. I did my best to reassure them, telling them it was a grown-up problem that didn't change how much I loved them. But inside, I was struggling to feel that same certainty. Days turned into weeks, and I slowly started adjusting to this new reality. I threw myself into work, focusing on projects and tasks that distracted me from the emptiness I felt at home. I kept busy with the kids, doing everything I could to maintain some sense of normalcy for their sake. Friends and family reached out, offering support and advice, and I did my best to put on a brave face, to act like I was handling everything with grace. But late at night, when the house was quiet and everyone was asleep, the weight of it all would come crashing down. It was in those quiet moments that I realized I'd lost a part of myself. The betrayal had left scars, deeper than I'd expected, and it wasn't just about Sarah's lies. It was about the years I'd spent building a life I thought was real, only to discover it had been built on quicksand. The love I'd given, the sacrifices, the dreams. I had to let go of them all, to somehow move forward with a heart that felt hollow. One night, I sat in my living room, surrounded by photos of the family I'd cherished, and something shifted. I realized that no matter what Sarah had done, no matter how much she'd taken, there were parts of my life she couldn't touch. My time with the kids, the memories we'd made together, those belonged to me, and nothing could change that. The love I'd poured into my family hadn't been a waste, even if the foundation I'd built it on had crumbled. I decided, then and there, that I'd rebuild my life, one piece at a time. I'd focus on the things that mattered, the things I could control. The future was uncertain, and there were still plenty of hard days ahead, but I knew I wasn't going to let her betrayal define the rest of my life. In the morning, I took down the old family photos and put them in a box, storing them in the attic. It was a small step, but it felt like the beginning of something new, a way to move forward with the dignity I'd fought so hard to protect. With the old family photos boxed away, I felt a strange sense of relief, like a burden had been lifted, even if only slightly. I'd spent weeks feeling like I was living in a shadow of my old life, but I was ready to make some changes, to take back control over what I could. I didn't want to live in a place that felt haunted by the memories of what I'd lost. So I began with the small things. I rearranged the living room, moved the couch to a different corner, replaced the old coffee table with one I'd built years ago in my garage, a little project I'd been proud of. I cleaned out the kitchen, got rid of the little knickknacks Sarah had brought home over the years. Things that once felt like they made the house a home, but now just felt like reminders of a life that wasn't really mine. Each item I tossed, each room I reconfigured, felt like I was reclaiming a bit of myself, putting a new stamp on my own life. The kids adjusted to these changes without much fuss. To them, the new setup was just a different arrangement, nothing more. They'd run around the house, laughing and playing like always, and seeing them so unaffected gave me a strange kind of comfort. At least for them, things were still normal in their world. I reminded myself that they didn't need to know the whole story. They didn't need the weight of adult problems. I wanted them to feel safe, even if I was still figuring things out. One evening, I was in the garage working on a new project when my oldest came out and asked if we could talk. He looked nervous, and for a second, I wondered if he'd picked up on more than I'd realized. He sat beside me, fiddling with one of my old tools, his face serious. After a long pause, he finally asked if I was okay, if things would ever go back to the way they were. The weight of his words hit me hard. I looked him in the eye, telling him as honestly as I could that things would be different, but that didn't mean they'd be worse. I reassured him that no matter what, I'd always be there for him and his siblings. They were still my kids, and that wasn't going to change. As I spoke, I could see the relief on his face, and it hit me how much my strength mattered to them, how much they needed me to be steady, even if my world felt like it was on shaky ground. After he went back inside, I stayed in the garage for a long time, thinking about the life I still had ahead of me. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that I needed to rebuild not just the house or the routine, but myself. The man who'd walked into that courtroom was broken, worn down by betrayal and loss. But I wasn't going to stay that man. I couldn't, not for myself and not for my kids. They needed a father who was whole, who was willing to keep going, no matter how tough things got. Over the next few weeks, I started focusing on things I'd set aside over the years. I spent more time working on projects in the garage, fixing up old furniture, building new pieces. There was something calming about it, the simple act of creating something with my hands, of putting pieces together in a way that made sense, that felt stable. It was therapy of sorts, a way to remind myself that I could still build things that would last. I also made an effort to reconnect with old friends, people I'd lost touch with while I'd been so focused on family and work. They welcomed me back with open arms, and I found myself laughing in a way I hadn't in a long time. Slowly, life began to feel more balanced, less defined by what I'd lost and more by what I still had. There were hard days, of course. Days when I'd catch myself thinking about the life I thought I'd be living, the future I'd imagined for us all. But every time those thoughts crept in, I'd remind myself that this was a chance to start fresh. I wasn't bound to the past anymore. I could create something new, something real. Bit by bit, I was reclaiming my life, shaping it into something that felt like my own again. And while there was still a lot to sort through, a lot of healing left to do, I was finally starting to see a path forward, one step at a time. In the months that followed, life began to settle into a new rhythm. I'd learned to take things day by day, focusing on small wins. Things like getting through a family dinner without the kids noticing anything was off or waking up without that hollow ache in my chest. It wasn't perfect, and there were moments that still felt raw, but at least I was moving forward. The kids seemed to adjust well to the changes, though there were times when they'd ask about their mom, wondering why she wasn't around as much. I'd tell them she was going through her own challenges, and they didn't need to worry. I kept things simple, not wanting to burden them with more than they could handle. But as they grew older, I knew that someday I'd have to tell them the truth, or some version of it. For now, though, I kept things focused on us, on the family we still were, even if it looked a little different than before. My oldest started taking an interest in my projects in the garage, asking if he could help out. He'd come out in the afternoons, watching as I worked on restoring an old cabinet or sanding down a table I'd found at a thrift store. We didn't talk much, but I could tell he was picking up on more than he let on. There were days when I'd catch him glancing at me with a quiet sort of understanding that only deepened my resolve to move forward. Outside of the house, I kept busy with work, throwing myself into new projects and challenges. I'd always been proud of my job, but now it felt like a lifeline, something steady to hold on to when everything else felt uncertain. The respect I'd earned from my team, the sense of purpose I found in each project, those things kept me grounded. And over time, I began to realize that I was rediscovering a part of myself that I'd almost lost, the part that didn't rely on anyone else's validation or approval. Friends became a big part of my journey too. People I hadn't seen in years suddenly felt like family, rallying around me in ways I hadn't expected. We'd go out for drinks, watch a game, or just sit around sharing stories, and I found comfort in their laughter, in the shared memories we'd built over the years. They reminded me of who I was before everything fell apart and showed me that there was life beyond betrayal, that I could find joy and peace again, even if it took time. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat out on the back porch with a beer in hand, looking up at the stars. The house was quiet, peaceful in a way that felt strange yet comforting. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope, like maybe, just maybe, I could create a life that wasn't overshadowed by the pain of the past. It wouldn't be the life I'd planned, but it would be mine, built on my terms. As I sat there, I thought about forgiveness. not for Sarah necessarily but for myself. I'd spent so much time feeling foolish, humiliated, and broken. But sitting there in the stillness, I realized I was ready to let go of those feelings, to stop punishing myself for trusting someone who hadn't deserved it. I couldn't go back and change the past, but I could choose how I'd live in the future. The next day, I woke up with a new sense of purpose. There was no dramatic change, no sudden epiphany. It was just a small shift, a decision to stop letting her choices dictate my life. I got up, made breakfast for the kids, and went about the day with a quiet determination. Each step forward felt like a piece of the life I wanted to build, and as the days turned into weeks, I found myself focusing less on what I'd lost and more on what I could create. I was learning to see the future as an open space, a chance to start fresh and redefine what happiness looked like for me and my kids. Bit by bit, I was healing, finding strength in the love I still had to give and the life I still had left to live. In time, the pain started to fade. It didn't disappear. Some things leave scars that never fully go away, but it began to feel more like a memory than an open wound. Life settled into a steady routine, and I found a certain comfort in the simplicity of it. I'd wake up, make breakfast for the kids, go to work, come home, and spend the evenings helping with homework or working on my latest project in the garage. It wasn't the life I'd once dreamed of, but it was a good life, one I could be proud of. One Saturday, I took the kids to the lake. It was something we used to do as a family, back when the kids were little and life felt uncomplicated. I packed a cooler with snacks, loaded up the fishing gear, and drove us out there, the kids chattering in the back seat as we wound down familiar roads. When we arrived, I watched as they ran down to the water, laughing and splashing, and for a moment, I felt that sense of peace that I'd almost forgotten existed. Sitting there by the water, with my kids playing nearby and the sun shining down, I felt a quiet kind of joy. It was the simple happiness of being with the people who mattered most to me, a reminder that I still had so much to be grateful for. I spent the day teaching my youngest how to cast a line, laughing with my oldest about the fish that got away, and just soaking in the moment. On the drive home, the kids fell asleep, their heads resting against the windows, their faces peaceful. I felt a pang of sadness that their lives would be marked by this, by a fractured family and memories they'd one day question. But I also knew that I had the chance to give them stability, to show them that life could be good again, even after something as painful as betrayal. Back at the house, I carried them inside, one by one, and tucked them into bed. As I watched them sleep, I made a promise to myself to keep going, to keep building a life that was strong and steady, something they could rely on, even if things hadn't turned out the way I'd planned. Over the following months, I noticed that things began to come together in small ways. The house started to feel like my own, with new furniture, rearranged rooms, and spaces that felt fresh and uncluttered by old memories. The kids adjusted, and they grew closer to me in ways that I hadn't expected. They'd come to me with questions, ask for advice, or just sit with me in comfortable silence. We were finding a new rhythm, one that felt real and grounded. Friends and family kept checking in, offering their support, and I began to realize how lucky I was to have people around me who cared. They'd invite me out for coffee, come by with homemade meals, or just lend an ear when I needed it. It was during one of these visits, as I sat talking with an old friend, that I realized something important. I'd survived. I'd faced one of the hardest experiences of my life, and I'd come through the other side with my dignity intact, my integrity still whole. There were moments when memories would surface, or when I'd catch myself thinking of the life I thought I'd have. But instead of feeling sadness, I started to feel a sense of closure. I could remember the good times without the bitterness, look back on the past without letting it cloud my future. Eventually, I began to feel ready to think about new possibilities. The idea of moving forward no longer felt like betrayal. It felt like a step toward a life that was fully my own. I started to think about the things I wanted to do, the places I wanted to see, the hobbies I'd always put off. For the first time in years, the future felt like an open space, something I could shape on my own terms. And so, bit by bit, I let go of the pain, the betrayal, the anger. I let go of the life I'd once planned, opening myself to the life I was building now. A life rooted in resilience, hope, and a quiet, hard-earned strength. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, I was in the garage working on a small table I'd been restoring. I'd picked it up at a yard sale for a couple of bucks, and it had clearly seen better days, with scratches and dents covering its surface. But as I sanded it down and smoothed out the rough patches, I started to see its potential, a beauty that had been hidden under years of wear and neglect. There was something satisfying about bringing it back to life, about uncovering the strength and character that had always been there, even if it hadn't been obvious. In a strange way, I realized I was doing the same thing with my own life. I was stripping away the parts that didn't serve me, the remnants of a broken past, and slowly rebuilding something new, something that felt true to who I was becoming. The table, like me, was getting a second chance, a fresh start. Over the following weeks, I continued to dive into projects around the house and in the garage. Each completed piece, each freshly painted wall, felt like a step toward a new chapter. Friends and neighbors started to notice the changes, stopping by to chat or comment on how things were looking. They'd ask me about the latest piece I was working on, and I found myself talking with pride about the little transformations I'd created. It was a small thing maybe, but it reminded me that life was full of possibilities, even when it didn't turn out the way you'd planned. One day, an old friend came by, bringing his wife and 2 kids over for a visit. They'd been supportive through everything, and seeing them as a family, with the kids running around the yard, made me feel like life was falling into place again. We sat around the table, talking about work, life, the ups and downs, and as I laughed along with them, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the people who'd stuck by me, who'd shown me what real loyalty looked like. Later that night, after they'd left and the house was quiet, I sat down with a notebook and started writing out some goals. I'd lost a lot, sure, but there was also so much ahead of me. I wrote down simple things, a list of books I wanted to read, a few places I wanted to visit, projects I wanted to tackle around the house. There was something powerful in seeing those goals on paper, in acknowledging that I still had dreams, even after everything I'd been through. As I finished my list, I felt a surge of hope. It was subtle, but it was real. I didn't have to have everything figured out yet. I just had to keep moving forward, one day at a time. I could see now that I had a future, one that was mine to shape with my own hands on my own terms. The past was there, always a part of my story. But it wasn't the whole story, not anymore. I was ready to let the old chapters close and embrace the new ones that lay ahead. And as I looked around at the life I was rebuilding, I felt, for the first time in a long time, truly at peace. Months passed, and life took on a new kind of stability, one that felt richer and more real than before. There were still moments of quiet reflection, times when memories would surface, bringing back flashes of what was and what could have been. But they didn't shake me the way they used to. Instead, they reminded me of how far I'd come, of the strength I'd found in starting over. The kids grew closer to me, and our bond felt deeper than ever. I was no longer just their dad. I was their anchor, the constant in a life that had shifted dramatically. They didn't know everything, but they knew I was there for them, always, and that knowledge was enough for now. We created new routines, shared new memories, and I realized that, despite the pain, there was a kind of beauty in this second chance we'd been given as a family. One Saturday, I decided to take the kids to a place we'd always talked about visiting but never found the time for. A hiking trail up in the mountains, a place full of open sky and wild landscapes. It was a fresh start, a new memory waiting to be made, and I felt ready to embrace it. We spent the day hiking, laughing, and soaking in the beauty around us. Watching them climb rocks, race along the trail, and point out birds in the sky, I felt a joy that ran deeper than I could put into words. On the way home, as the kids drifted off to sleep in the back seat, I found myself thinking of the future with a sense of calm. There was no more anger, no more bitterness. Just a quiet determination to live fully, to be the best father and man I could be, and to embrace the new path I was on. Back at home, as I put the kids to bed, I caught a glimpse of myself in the hallway mirror. The man looking back at me was different than the one I'd been a year ago. There were still shadows in his eyes, traces of the battle he'd been through, but there was also strength, resilience, and a steady kind of peace that I hadn't felt before. I'd faced my worst fears, lost nearly everything, and yet here I was, standing stronger than I'd ever been. In that moment, I realized I was ready to let go fully, to leave the past where it belonged and walk forward, knowing I had a future that was mine to shape. It wouldn't be perfect, it wouldn't always be easy, but it would be real. And for the first time, I felt grateful for every twist, every heartbreak, every lesson I'd learned along the way. I turned off the lights, leaving the house in peaceful darkness. The journey had been long, but I was finally home, within myself, in my life, and in a future that was waiting, open and uncharted. And as I closed the door on that chapter for good, I knew I was ready to begin a new one.